Hi, welcome to Week 10, Lecture 1 of the Sociology of Work and Technology. Studying how societies categorize or classify people and how those systems of categorization and classification develop has been central to sociology since the beginning of the discipline. Really understanding how we classify people and things is foundational to society itself, and thus foundational to the study of society, which is sociology. Classification and categories are basic building blocks of culture, or, the context in which we understand our world and our place within it. Think about it. How we understand everyday life, how we understand what goes with what doesn't fit with something else. That's all about classification. Classification also shapes how we're understood by institutions. Think about what you do when you fill out government forms or when you fill out forms at Queen's. You check boxes. You're asked to classify yourself in terms of gender, in terms of race or ethnicity, in terms of age, in terms of citizenship, nationality, and so on and so forth. This affects how you're perceived by those institutions, which affects how resources are allocated to you within those institutions. In a different context, you could think about when you use social media. There, you're classified by the various platforms you might use. You're classified in terms of demographics, but also in terms of interests, in terms of what you do, what you like. And they use that information to sell you, as a user, to advertisers, who in turn try to sell you things. So classification is very important there as well. Now, like I said, studying how people and things are classified and how those systems of classification develop is central to the study of society, or sociology. Classification systems are a major part of culture. We generally ask things as sociologists like, how do different societies classify the world? What categories do they use? How does a society group people and things together? And this goes all the way back to Durkheim, who you might have read in other courses. He found that categories used to understand the world vary from society to society or from culture to culture, and he argued that categorization or classification reflects social structure. In other words, classification systems mirror social relationships. And they emerge, these classification systems, from a social process. In other words, these aren't natural classifications or natural categories. They're not natural, but they are socially produced. So, the sociological question is then, who makes the categories or classifications? Who controls the classification systems that determine how resources are allocated within institutions such as work, school, or the government? From there, we might ask, how do those classification systems come to be? How do they come to be what they are? And whose interests do classification systems serve? Now here, Sallaz makes a good point when he says that classifications are ways of drawing boundaries. And he says there are two kinds of boundary making, or ways of drawing lines between groups, or drawing lines between things. There are individual boundaries, or how we as individuals relate to categories and how we choose to identify, as well as maybe how we're identified by others. And then there are also institutional boundaries, which are made when groups of people attempt to shift the meaning of a category or a classification. Now, regardless of what you think about a particular classification system or category, you still have to grapple with it. And so that individual form of boundary making, as well as that institutional kind of boundary making, may be in tension, especially if you don't agree with the particular system that you find yourself in, right? Now, we've already seen classification in the context of work. Think about class. For Marx, class is there's just two classes. There's just two categories. There's just two ways of classifying people in terms of class for Marx, right? There's the proletariat and there's capitalists. There's workers and there's capitalists. It's a classic Marxist way of classifying workers and their boss, but it's not the most useful because there are a lot of fine-grained divisions within the working class. And we've also seen that. There are these divisions along lines of race, divisions along lines of gender as well. And then there's also occupational divisions, right? Which is why we saw the introduction of all those different ways of classifying workers: blue collar, white collar, green collar, pink collar, no collar, etc. Now, those classification systems, at least those different collars that I just described, that might be useful to scholars, might even be useful for yourself in identifying different kinds of work. But those aren't codified in some particular by the state, right? Those aren't codified by the state or some other institution. Now, what the state does define when it comes to class is it defines occupational categories such as management, clerical workers, legal professionals, educators, food service workers, etc. And it also uses industrial categories such as manufacturing, agriculture, information industries, higher education, etc. So there are these, different kinds of classifications. There are this kind of scholarly or even kind of folk classifications, ways that we might classify things in everyday life. But then there are also state classifications, which are considered official, right? In that the state defines things legally. So why might state classification matter for work? Well, some activities are considered work and some activities are not considered work by the state. Some work is considered valuable or worth being paid for, while other work is not. Consider all the unpaid work needed to get a job, or all the work that goes into keeping a job, driving to and from work, feeding yourself, maintaining your home so that you have a clean place to sleep and prepare yourself to go back to work. And for those of you who have jobs, think about all the stuff you do for work, but that doesn't count toward your paid hours. Think, for example, of all the extra work that we read about that people have to do to be freelancers. Managing emails, all the extra work that they have to do to prepare themselves to work. That was described last week in the readings on time. Now, according to Sallaz, we might have everyday ways of classifying these things, but in the end, it's the state's classification system that matters. It matters it matters insofar as it shapes how resources are allocated to us. Now, why is that? Well, the state determines labor laws and labor rights that are afforded to people, but only if what the people are doing is considered to be work. Think of all the things that kind of look like work, right? Kind of smell like work, kind of seem like work, but that they aren't technically considered to be work and thus can go unpaid, at least legally speaking. Sallaz gives the example of university athletes, but also prison labor. Alongside those examples, think about household work, which is most often performed by women. Or you could also think about work that's performed by undocumented workers who might not feel as though they have the ability to exercise their rights when it comes to labor. What? We could also think about work that's performed by undocumented workers who, if left unpaid, might not feel as though they have the ability to exercise their rights because of how they're classified by the state. Most of these activities are not classified as work in the same way that being, for example, a waiter or being a software programmer is classified as work. They're also not subject to the same protections, and in the case of housework, people are often wholly unpaid for that. Think of all the housewives around the world who receive nothing for their toil in the home. That's because what they do isn't classified as work. And there are actually movements in the 1970s and even to this day to demand wages for housework. Now, Sallaz talks a lot about this sort of stuff, but, he's American and he references America a lot. So I wonder, maybe in your discussions you could you could offer, some obvious Canadian examples in the discussion forum, alongside some of the examples that I've given in the optional news articles from the Toronto Star and the CBC that are up on the course website. I hope those optional readings help you understand that classification systems vary from place to place, but that all nations have classification systems that affect resource allocation and rights allocation. This varies from nation to nation and, even province to province. But the point is that the social relationship in which the state is the key arbiter when it comes to categories and classification. That's kind of the key point. This is why Sallaz borrows from Pierre Bourdieu and calls the state the symbolic bank. Now, in determining what counts as work and what does not, classification systems divide along race, gender, and class. Again, we see this in the undervaluing of women's work and the historic and ongoing exclusion of people of color from the formal economy, and thus also from labor protections. Historically, labor unions and professional associations also excluded people based on the categories those people occupied in terms of race and gender. Age also affects workers' rights when thinking of who may work and when. Consider children below a certain age cannot legally work. This was not always the case, but it is the product of a collective struggle against child labor, just as the inclusion of women and people of color is the product of collective struggles that demanded that the state make it illegal to discriminate and illegal to employ children. Now, classification can be dealt with at the level of individuals. You can say, oh, well, I don't believe in this way of classifying the world, or I do believe in this other classification system. But more often, real change occurs due to collective mobilization, right? Or due to social movements. Now, this can go both ways, for and against working people. So, for example, capitalists have sought to erode classifications of what is or is not work and to deregulate industries, while workers have sought to expand what counts as work and to expand regulations. This is something that's ongoing when it comes to platform-based work in the gig economy. Likewise, women have often fought to have their work recognized both in the home and in the workplace. But organizations, often led by men, maintain efforts to exclude and underpay women. Now, with all that to think about, I'll see you next time in the next video, where I'll talk about classification and app-based work in the gig economy. See you then.